Baby, if you've ever wondered whatever became of me, I'm living on the air in Cincinnati, WKRP. Got kind of tired packing and unpacking, town to town and up and down the dial. Maybe you and me were never meant to be, but baby, think of me once in a while. I'm at WKRP in Cincinnati.
Oh, so sincere. Or was it? Welcome to Every Friday with Dan and Olivia. I'm Dan Miles. Olivia is still out of town working on her latest film project, so we wish her well and send her our regards. That swanky opening number was by Richard Cheese from his Dick at Night album. Our topic today is going to be that popular television series he was singing about, which premiered in 1978 and ran for 4 seasons, at least in its initial run. You've heard me mention the Mission Log podcast before, which is co-hosted by our friend John Champion. The premise of that show is to analyze every episode of every incarnation of Star Trek. Joining me today are 2 intrepid podcasters who have deemed WKRP worthy of that same in-depth analysis. They launched their show, Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser, the WKRP in Cincinnati podcast, back in 2015, which, as you may recall, is the same year Olivia and I launched this show. Joining me on the Skype to explain the weird name of their show are Michael Grasso. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Dan.
And Robert MacDougall. Welcome, Rob.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Dan.
Before we get to the deliberately mystifying name you chose for your podcast, I want to point out that you record the show via the internet because not only do you live in 2 different cities, you actually live in 2 different countries. So let's start off by having you tell us where you're both based, and then transition over to how you know each other. In a shameless display of podcasting patriotism, which will fall short of chanting USA, let's start with the American. Where are you tonight, sir, in America?
This is Mike, and I am in Boston, Massachusetts. I am Boston born and bred. I've lived here pretty much all but 4 years of my life, and it's my hometown, and I love it dearly.
This is Rob, and I'm the Canadian. I'm talking to you from London, Ontario, Canada. Ontario and Canada are hotbeds of WKRP in Cincinnati love, as we've discovered doing the podcast. But I did go down to Boston for graduate school, and that's when I met Mike. And this podcast, among its many other virtues, lets me continue to talk to Mike every week about a subject that is near and dear to our hearts.
I'm going to assume that some of the people listening right now are familiar with WKRP and others are not. And I'd imagine that's also true of your own listeners. I realize you don't have precise figures, but how would you imagine that your listenership breaks down in that area in terms of those who were already well acquainted with the show, like myself, versus those who are actually using your show as an introduction to the series?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely gotten some people into WKRP with the podcast, which again feels kind of bizarre, but mostly they're folks that didn't watch it when it was on in syndication in the 80s. Because Rob and I, both came to it kind of, watching it after school, and that seems to be sort of the vast majority of our guests also got to watching the show when it was just on sort of endlessly in syndication during that mid to late 80s time period.
Mike's right that it is a little funny, a little weird, but that we do again and again hear of people who are enjoying the show, who are, who didn't watch, who are too young to have watched. And I think that, what Mike and I try and do with WKRP on the podcast, we love WKRP, and we would be happy just to talk about the minutia of Johnny Fever and Venus Flytrap and Les Nessman and Herb Tarlek for days on end. But actually, Mike and I are both historians, and we, while we talk about WKRP, we also try and use WKRP as a window back onto the 1970s and 80s and talk about whatever else happens in the episode, comes up in the episode, whatever associations it sparks. We're not afraid of going off on tangents and turning it into a little history lesson or a little pop culture music lesson. And I think that, we try and strike a balance so that there's something for the WKRP neophytes and something for the hardcore KRPers.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about your show, how you provide context for it. Now, I'm a little older than you guys, and I can tell you, I actually witnessed the series premiere back in September of 1978 of WKRP, season 1, episode 1. I was right there. Now, I had just turned 15. I had an electric guitar. I'd been playing in bands for a year or so. So my mother heard about this upcoming new show that was set at a rock radio station. She figured I might be interested in it.
That's awesome.
That's perfect. You're the perfect demographic for that show.
Okay. Yeah. Now here's the thing, guys. I was interested in it, but we're talking about network television, whose depiction of rock and roll tended to be very watered down, family friendly, Partridge Family type fare. They didn't want to offend anybody, which of course runs directly counter to the rock and roll mythos. So we're here to offend when we rock out. So I would tell you guys, with expectations low and substantial reservations regarding the musical component of the show, I tuned in, I checked it out. Okay, it's rolling along. It's kind of okay. It's not too bad. Then this character unrolls a Kiss poster and hangs it on the wall. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, they are referencing an actual real world, honest to goodness band that people know about and people listen to. This isn't like a joke parody of a band. It isn't like a lookalike that's supposed to remind you of Kiss. This is a Kiss poster that half of my friends already own and have on their wall. So at that moment, I knew this was not going to be your everyday run-of-the-mill sitcom.
Getting the details right is so important, just in terms of how it signals, inside or outside, or whether this is for real. Maybe it's not as true today because just the way that television has sort of splintered into a zillion subcultures. But yeah, what you're saying, that in 1978, 1975, 1976, when a rock band was on television, it was like some weird amalgam of the Beatles and the Monkees and the Way Outs when they were on the Flintstones or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And it just sort of signified, goofy rock music, crazy long hair. And so to actually use real bands, real songs, which would lead the show into all sorts of trouble once it got into syndication. But the use of the real bands and songs was so important to just making WKRP real. And I think, for someone like you at age 15, or someone like, for people like Mike and I watching it as a little bit younger, making it cool, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you knew it was legit. So how did you guys go from being fans of that show to wanting to create a podcast about it?
That is an excellent question, one I wonder about many, many times when we go through one of these seasons of the show. But I think it was that point in 2015 where I think the podcast bubble was starting to kind of like not burst, but like all of a sudden you kind of knew people who did podcasts. And I think that kind of started us thinking about it. We had a friend, Chris Tatro, who was actually a guest host in our first season of the podcast, who kind of started throwing around the idea, well, we could do a WKRP podcast at some point. And it kind of just sat there for like 6 months, if I remember correctly, in our inboxes, and just sort of like taunting us to the possibility of actually going through with this insane project. And then one day I think we just decided, well, why don't we do this?
Yeah, I think that the trigger was probably Shout Factory putting out the DVD set of the show. That for a long time you couldn't get the show on DVD, or you could get one season and it was the really butchered version that appeared in syndication. Shout Factory came out with a DVD. They did a great job. They didn't get every single song, but they did a great job getting something like 85-90% of the songs. And then, like Mike says, 2015 podcasts were starting to mushroom up everywhere, and rewatch podcasts were a thing, but it was only like current hot shows like Game of Thrones. And there was something about the idea of doing this on WKRP that was so demented. I actually think it gave me permission to do it, because Mike will tell you, I've been talking, my day job is that I'm a history professor, and I've been talking for ages about doing kind of a serious history of science, history of technology podcast. I had that idea before the WKRP podcast, but it was sort of intimidating that I would have to be smart on it. And something about just the dementedness of doing a rewatch podcast of a 35-year-old sitcom, I don't know, it just gave me permission to be like, well, let's see if this works. And even in the first episode, you can hear Mike and I saying, like, I wonder if we'll find enough stuff to talk about. And here we are, 2 years and 50 episodes and something like 70 hours later, closing in on season 4. And yeah, we haven't run out of things to talk about.
But to tie in with what you just said, like I said, I saw the episodes on their first run. But this was just prior to the arrival and the prevalence of the VHS and the home video era, which meant that when people were securing music rights for something, all they had on their mind was the original airing of the episode, reruns on the network, maybe syndication. Nobody was thinking about selling episodes of the show to individual households on videotape or Laserdisc or DVD. So it wasn't like they had an understanding. There was no precedent for that. And, my tie into that is Olivia's show, The Wonder Years. Very similar. Yeah. All the music rights were expensive, tied up, but it was so integral to some of the plots that her set didn't come out till just recently. And that's a show that's been off the air for so long. And so, it created huge problems down the road for shows like WKRP and The Wonder Years.
Well, who thought that people would be watching these things 35 years later? Mike and I were talking on the podcast about the BBC taped over half of the old Doctor Who's. Like, that's how temporary this shit was.
Right.
They're like, well, no one's going to watch this again in 30 years, in 50 years. Doctor Who is 50 years old and people are still watching it.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning that you guys had kind of a weird name for your show, and that does relate to this issue of music licensing. So I want to get to that. But first, as I said, I was an original viewer of the show, and I wanted to use this whole discussion of the music rights just as an excuse to play this.
Don't touch that.
I'm sorry, I was...
Gripping music, huh?
Yeah, that's good, all right. What's the name of that orchestra?
Pink Floyd.
Oh, is that Pink Floyd? Do I hear dogs barking on that thing?
I do.
Good, aren't they? Hey, here's a thing called Pigs on the Wing. What does that sound like?
I don't do requests.
Well, just keep up the good work.
Giving it all I got.
So I see.
So never mind seeing a poster of Kiss. Here's a situation where viewers are hearing the music of Pink Floyd, and the characters are holding up the album cover and commenting on it. How often does that happen on network TV? I'll tell you how often. Once, and you just heard it. So this is a case of the show being unable to secure the rights and having to substitute a knockoff recording, which sort of ruins the authenticity we were talking about for, the more nostalgic fans like myself. But the Pink Floyd thing doesn't even compare to the Elton John situation. So who wants to take on explaining to us the connection between this, Elton, and Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser?
Okay, I've tried to explain this twice on our podcast and done very poorly, so I want to vindicate myself. Third time's the charm, okay? I'm going to explain it as succinctly and quickly as I possibly can. So there is a reference in an episode from season 2 called The Americanization of Ivan, where this Russian defector comes to the station, and he becomes enamored of all of these American Western things like blue jeans and Elton John music. and Bailey. She's also of America and of the West. And basically, he and Bailey have a little bit of a thing going on. And sort of their trademark song is Tiny Dancer, because he heard it on the radio on WKRP, I guess. And when the episode went to syndication, they couldn't even mention the titles of songs. So when he says, "Hold Me Closer, Tiny Dancer," in the original episode, in syndication, it was turned into the nonsensical phrase, "Hold my order, terrible dresser." And that was probably the best I've ever done explaining that. I'm very happy.
So we chose as a title for our podcast a line of nonsensical dialogue that's hard to remember, that doesn't even appear in the actual show. And that's not what people would call good SEO, search engine optimization. But
it was definitely meant as kind of an in-joke for the real super fans. And I think that it was kind of perverse of us to start from the very beginning of playing the podcast saying, all right, we're going to call it this because the right people will get it. And the right people have gotten it for sure. But the thing is, you're right. It's not as catchy a title as maybe you'd want.
Well, the cool thing is now people who've listened to this podcast can feel like insiders because they know the story behind your name. And there again, in my generation, it was Tiny Dancer. So if I think of that episode, I remember the song. And it was really there. So, "Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser," I had to listen to your show to find out what that meant because I hadn't seen
what we were talking about.
the weird, crappy dubbed one.
And it is definitely a nod to the fact that we both ended up, getting to love the show in syndication. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. Again, if you're 9 or 10 watching it, and that's the age I was, you don't know all the songs, especially if they're from the 70s, and you're a 10-year-old kid in 1985, and all you care about is what's on MTV right now.
So after Pink Floyd Dogs, I think the most egregious musical omission involves the scene where Les Nessman is trying out his new toupee to the strains of Hot Blooded by Foreigner. Okay.
Oh, yes.
So, and that's what I saw when it first came out. Les Nessman, the sort of goofy dude on the show, rocking out to Foreigner. Now, it's a hilarious scene. It's a comical juxtaposition. But, later versions where they had to substitute more generic music for people who never knew any better, whatever. It kind of ruins it for me again. And we understand the legalities and, other shows have had this problem. Yeah. But the reason I'm really emphasizing this is not long ago, I interviewed Lou Gramm on my other show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Friends of Damn Music Podcast. And we spoke about the song Hot Blooded. And I debated whether or not to bring WKRP into it because I didn't know his role in the process in terms of granting permission, how much to charge for it, was he even consulted? Did the record label do it? Did they go to the writers? Did he say yes? So what I ended up doing is, as we were sort of winding down our conversation of the song, I kind of alluded to it. One thing I need to sort of preface, I'm going to play this little clip of my interview with him. And one thing I need to set up is that they were doing a concert, like a big old Day on the Green, Cal Jam kind of thing, where at that point they'd only done 2 albums. They didn't really have a ton of material. And they were getting encores, and they were running out of stuff to play. And they hadn't recorded Hot Blooded yet. They hadn't even finished writing it. And so they actually debuted that song in an unfinished form in front of thousands of people. So that's where it picks up. And then the WKRB thing, I think his response, even though I moved on, I personally think it's kind of telling. So let's give that a listen. So what was it like to debut a song you hadn't even recorded yet to this huge live audience?
Well, we were in a huddle backstage after we came off, and they were giving us an encore, and we were trying to think what in the world we could play. And when we decided on Hot Blooded, I turned to Mick. I said, "The lyrics aren't even finished yet." He said, "Sing the same ones 3 times." The verses. I had 1 verse done, and so I sang that same verse 3 times, and we finished the song, and that brought the house down. So we weren't going to do another encore, but it was amazing to see a rough, unfinished song had something in it already that was infectious to the audience, and that was a precursor to a little knock on the head that we had a hot single there.
Oh yeah, and what a way to find out sort of organically and spontaneously. And again, another gutsy move is like, this wasn't 100 people at the country bar. This was like, thousands of people ready for a full day of music. Like, yeah. And then not only do you guys have the guts to go do it, but it like just goes down so well. It's just one of those things you can't script. It's one of those things that just happens.
Somewhere there's a recording of that I've heard, and it's funny to hear me sing that same verse 3 times, but you hear behind me the crowd shouting and stuff, and it was it worked.
Yeah, I wonder if Les Nessman was there that day. Okay, I'm guessing from the way he laughed, he knew Les Nessman. He knew he knew the connection with the song Hot Blooded, and he just laughed about it like, oh yeah, Les Nessman, Hot Blooded.
That was nicely done, Dan, the way you slid that in. I was wondering how you could subtly bring up the fact that it played while Les put on his Mr. Macho wig for the first time. But yeah, the laugh that Lou gave you sounds to me like the laugh of someone who, at the very least, knows who Les Nessman is and why he might have listened to Hot Blooded.
I mean, we can't ignore the fact that also another Foreigner song got used in season 4. We just did this episode of the bomb at the station's transmitter, and they end the cliffhanger with "Urgent" off of 4, and it's just used so well again. I mean, I don't know if
the song actually is the only thing that reveals that the bomb is in the toolbox. That's right, Johnny's tapping the toolbox. Urgent, yeah.
And these bands got tons of exposure. This was before MTV. Most of the history of WKRP was before MTV anyway, and you're getting out on national network television during prime time. I mean, we've talked about Blondie and Heart of Glass and how that song really, took off because of WKRP. I mean, you're right. If Foreigner hadn't had a lot of big albums up to that point, having that kind of exposure on a new hot show and during season 1 must have been pretty big for them.
Well, it's so organic. It's a rock and roll radio station. They got to play something, right? And the thing about it is, as you guys mentioned on your current show about Start Me Up, you also mentioned with Tiny Dancer, okay, you can't say, "Hold Me Closer, Tiny Dancer." You have to say something else. Well, what if somebody's wearing a T-shirt that has a band? What if there's a picture or poster on the wall? So my guess is that licensing is different in those situations, because they can't say, we can't pixelate stuff on the wall. We can't take the T-shirt and turn it into, into Bob Marley if it's already Leonard Skinner. You know what I mean? So they have to make some allowances there. I think the thing that people from my generation have to understand, that given a choice of having it exactly the way you remember it or not having it at all, it's better to compromise, because there's a lot of comedy. Now, I don't want to see Arthur Carlson talking about Pigs on the Wing and some Pink Floyd sound-alike is playing, but at least I can laugh about it. And, let's be honest, there's ways and means to get, I played it already. There's the stuff is out there. It's floating around out there.
Yeah.
You can track it down, and some super fans did sort of yeoman's work for many years in the long years when you couldn't get it at all, sort of piecing together these old tapes of the show. Like I said, the Shout Factory DVDs, I think, are like 85 to 90% of all the stuff, which is pretty good. It's not everything.
Yeah.
We talked about how we discovered WKRP. I also want to be sure to mention how I originally discovered your show. Back in the fall of 2015, when we premiered the Every Friday podcast, I started checking the new and noteworthy section of the iTunes store to see if there was a mention of us, my show. Now I don't know how noteworthy we were at the time, but we were definitely new. And, so in order to do that, to look for yours, you have to peruse this sea of logos of all the other new and noteworthies. There's like 100 or 200 of them. And so as I was doing that, your guys' logo is a campaign poster for station manager Arthur Carlson in the style of the Obama Hope poster. So it's like, it's that thing. And then because Carlson was intentionally trying to lose the election, it wasn't like the most flattering picture of him. In fact, he looks like a lunatic, particularly in this enhanced version. So, I'm looking. What the hell? Arthur Carlson with a crazy look on his face, like an Obama poster, WKRP podcast. I have to make a note of that. I'll subscribe to that and check it out later. And so this teaches you guys the importance of, even though we're doing an audio presentation, sometimes graphic imagery. If you guys would have just had the letters WKRP, my eyes might have scanned right past it. Mm-hmm. So what drew me in was the logo, which now everybody's going to want to go see. So that also draws in these listeners now. Like, I gotta see this. So who came up with that logo?
This is a great story, because this is one of those situations where Rob and I have very complementary sort of skills. I mean, I think I came up with the idea, but Rob is the design guy who actually put together that fantastic Shepard Fairey takeoff poster. But I seem to remember talking about that episode and loving it, and loving that wackadoodle poster of Arthur Carlson, and going, Wouldn't it be funny if we made that into like the Obama, hope poster and everything? Because it would say so much about what we're like trying to do with the podcast, because we do talk about politics, we do talk about history. And then, Rob whipped it up and it was just perfect from day one.
That's right. It was Mike's idea. Definitely. We both love, I can't choose who my favorite character on WKRP is, but certainly Mr. Carlson, Arthur Carlson is right up there. Gordon Jump is wonderful. And just the still image of that intentionally bad election poster cracks us both up. And then, it was actually took a bit of work, a lot of photoshopping to make that into an Obama style Shepard Fairey poster. But I'm very happy with it, and 2 years later, it still cracks me up.
Yeah, every time I look at it on my phone, I do kind of just giggle to myself. It's just great.
well, speaking of Gordon Jump and giggling, there's something I found and saw for the first time today. I posted a link to it on your guys' Facebook page. You probably haven't got to it yet. But you always see Gordon Jump in character. I found an episode of Family Feud where it was WKRP versus the Love Boat. And everybody's looking like they do on the show. And Richard Dawson is the host. And, of course, Gordon Jump is the team captain.
That is a great little bit of video footage. People should totally track that down, this Family Feud episode. It actually makes me mad to watch it because I feel like Richard Dawson is showing blatant favoritism to the Love Boat gang. I think that he knows who all of them are. He knows the show. He's totally chummy with them. And then he goes over to the KRP gang, and this is their whole persona, right? They're the lovable underdogs. They're the misfits. And he's barely aware of what this show might be. That's the vibe I get. Maybe I'm just defensive and projecting, but that's the vibe I get.
I've seen that clip too. It's been a while since I've rewatched it, and I think you're spot on, Rob, because Aaron Spelling was God back then in 78, 79, and The Love Boat was a huge hit. And WKRP, while it was hot among certain populations and certain demographics of the sort of Nielsen ratings, was not this sort of nationwide appointment television kind of thing that Love Boat and Fantasy Island were. So I think you're right, Rob. I think he always gave, on those celebrity shows, he always gave favoritism to the higher rated, higher ranked shows.
And no matter if it was a celebrity guest or not, he kissed every single female on the lips.
Oh, of course.
Sure. No, that wouldn't stop him from kissing. I don't remember if both Jan and Lonnie were there, but he had no problem kissing them.
That guy's got to have some mononucleosis in his past. but I'll just tell everybody I won't spoil the outcome of it, and I'll post a link to it on our as mentioned on this week's show, everything, so everybody can easily see it. But the lineup is Gordon Jump, Lonnie Anderson's there, Frank Bonner's there, Tim Reed, and Howard Hesseman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And really pretty much everybody there does a pretty respectable job. There's a couple of sort of brain fart moments on both sides. Because, when you're sort of put on the spot like that to think of what did survey says, what's your pick? You're like, I don't know.
A lot of the KRP people have improv backgrounds. So, I would totally put Howard Hesseman or Frank Bonner. I'd take them on my trivia team or my feud team if I was going on the show because they're quick on their feet.
They acquitted themselves well. Yeah, definitely.